She knew it would be difficult, but she didn't imagine how painful it would be. Beatrice had been through many obstacles in her life, but what she was about to face would shake her in ways she never could have predicted. She had been working for the Anderson family for 2 years as a housekeeper. Her routine was a mix of humility and frustration. Her employers, from the upper class, treated her with superficial respect, but she knew her place. Deep down, she was just another invisible worker. Mr. Anderson, a 50-year-old man, always carried an air of superiority. He didn't make a point of hiding his disdain for people like her. He knew that no matter how hard she worked, she would never be a true part of that family. But nothing he did compared to his son's behavior. Lucas Anderson was 25, his mind full of dreams that he thought he could achieve effortlessly. She would see him from afar, on sunny mornings, when he descended the stairs of the grand house, with an arrogant smile and eyes that couldn't be called youthful anymore. Beatrice would watch him almost admiringly, even though she knew he had never spoken a kind word to her. But that day, something was different. She saw him arrive at the kitchen, where she was cleaning the counter. He approached, not with his usual arrogant tone, but with a strange expression, something Beatrice couldn't quite identify, but that made her feel a sharp discomfort. "You don't know how annoying it is when you make noise with the broom, do you?" he said harshly, as if speaking to a child. Beatrice looked at him, surprised. She had never imagined he would even notice her presence, but the tone of his voice sent a chill down her spine. He continued, "You don't need to bother me with your work, since I'm the one who pays you." In that moment, she realized he didn't even see her as a person, but as a mere tool to satisfy his needs. And something inside her broke, not because of his words, but because of the coldness with which he spoke. She had grown used to being ignored, but something about him was now stirring her in a way she couldn't control. When he walked away, she felt a pain in her chest, a mix of anger and frustration. She wanted to scream, but she knew her place was there, in the silence of cleaning. He had the power, not her. She was the housekeeper, he was the boss's son. And deep down, Beatrice knew this dynamic could change, but she didn't know how or where it would lead. Days turned into weeks, and Beatrice felt an undeniable change. What started as subtle, painful words from Lucas was beginning to form into something deeper. She couldn't explain it to herself, but each interaction left a mark on her. Lucas's actions became more erratic. Sometimes he would approach her with his usual arrogance, mocking her work, making condescending remarks. Other times, he'd stand by the window, looking out at the garden, lost in thought, as if he didn't know what to do with himself. Beatrice noticed these moments and couldn't help but feel a strange empathy toward him, something she never imagined she would experience. He started talking to her more frequently, and though it was often with a hint of cruelty, there were moments when his tone would soften. At times, he would sit at the kitchen table while she worked, staring at her as if waiting for her to speak. But she remained quiet, as she always had. She wasn't one to speak up, not in the presence of those who had control over her life. But one day, when Lucas came into the kitchen and leaned against the counter, Beatrice felt her heart race in a way she couldn't explain. He was different that day. He wasn't mocking her. He wasn't demanding anything from her. He simply looked at her with an expression that was almost vulnerable. "You've been working here for a long time, huh?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. Beatrice nodded, unsure how to respond. "I've seen you, always cleaning, always doing everything. You're good at your job." There was a long pause, and then he added, "Sometimes, I wish I had someone who worked as hard as you." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, it felt like they were the only two people in the world. Beatrice wanted to say something, anything, but she didn't know how. She simply nodded again and focused on her task, trying to avoid his gaze. Lucas's comments became more frequent, and she began to notice the shift in his behavior. He no longer mocked her openly. Instead, he would give her small, almost apologetic smiles when they passed in the hallways. She couldn't understand why this was happening, and yet it felt as though he was slowly trying to make amends for his previous behavior. The transformation was subtle, but it was real. In contrast, her employer, Mr. Anderson, had become more insistent with his advances. Whenever his wife wasn't around, he would make suggestive comments to Beatrice, calling her into his office for private discussions. His words were thick with desire, and he didn't seem to care about the power he held over her. "You know," he would say, "you don't have to work so hard for them. You could be with someone who appreciates you more, someone who can give you more." At first, Beatrice tried to ignore him, but his persistence grew. She began to feel trapped. She had always been careful to keep a professional distance, but now it felt like she was suffocating. Mr. Anderson's constant advances were a reminder of the boundaries he wanted to cross, and Beatrice didn't know how to stop him. Her internal struggle grew. She was beginning to understand that she could no longer remain in a situation that dehumanized her. But the options were few. Her only escape seemed to be in her quiet interactions with Lucas. The conversations, though small, had given her a sense of connection she had never imagined. And so, the tension between her loyalty to the family she worked for, her growing feelings for Lucas, and the unwanted advances from Mr. Anderson began to pull her in different directions. Beatrice realized that the only way out of this cycle was to face the truth, and she couldn't do it alone. It was a Thursday when Beatrice decided she could no longer bear the weight of her silence. The pressure had become unbearable between Mr. Anderson's advances, her unspoken feelings for Lucas, and the ongoing struggle to maintain her dignity. She knew she had to do something. She could no longer let herself be a pawn in a game that wasn't hers. That afternoon, as the house grew quiet, Beatrice took a deep breath and sat at the small desk in the corner of the room. She grabbed a piece of paper, her hand trembling slightly as she picked up the pen. There was no turning back now. The words had to come out. She wrote slowly at first, unsure how to begin, but as she put her thoughts to paper, the words began to flow. "Lucas," she wrote, "I don't know if you'll ever understand what I'm about to tell you, but I need you to know the truth. I've spent so many years hiding my feelings, pretending that I didn't notice the way you've treated me. But the truth is, I've never felt more invisible, not just to you, but to the world." She paused for a moment, the weight of the words sinking in. The pen hovered over the paper, as if it were waiting for her to continue. She had to be brave. There was no going back. Her heart was pounding, but she pressed on. "I've spent years in this house, watching as my worth was reduced to nothing more than a job. I've cleaned, I've served, I've been a shadow in your home. And through it all, I've heard the comments, the cruel words that you've thrown at me, words that have broken me little by little. But I've also seen the way you've changed. And maybe I'm foolish for believing that there's a side of you that's different. But I need to say this. I can't keep living this lie. I can't keep pretending that everything is okay when it isn't." She stopped again, trying to steady her breath. She had come this far, but she knew that what she was about to write would change everything. "I've come to realize that I deserve more than what I've been given. I deserve to be treated with respect. I deserve to be seen as more than just a maid in this house. And I've realized that I can't stay in this toxic situation any longer. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand. I need you to see me for who I am, not for what I can do for you, but for who I am as a person." She paused once again, the pen poised on the paper. She knew that the letter would be risky, that Lucas might never speak to her again after reading it. But she had to take this chance, for herself. "Please, Lucas, please understand that I've always cared for you, but I can no longer stay in this situation. I've made a decision to leave. I'm going to find my own way, away from this house, away from the hurt. I just needed you to know the truth." Beatrice signed the letter, her hand shaking as she set the pen down. It was done. The words were out, and there was no going back. The next morning, she placed the letter on Lucas's desk, her heart racing as she walked away. It felt like a final farewell to a chapter of her life that had been both painful and filled with unspoken hope. She couldn't predict what would happen next, but for the first time in years, she felt a sense of freedom. It wasn't much, but it was hers. The following days were nothing short of agonizing. Beatrice couldn't stop thinking about Lucas's reaction to the letter. What if he got angry? What if he didn't care at all? The uncertainty weighed heavily on her, but there was no turning back. She had made her choice. On Monday afternoon, as Beatrice was finishing her chores in the kitchen, she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. It was Lucas. His presence in the house was often a comfort, but today, it felt like the storm was approaching. He wasn't his usual self. His calm demeanor had been replaced by an intensity she hadn't seen before. "Beatrice," he said quietly, standing at the threshold of the kitchen. She turned, her heart leaping in her chest. She hadn't expected him to approach her so soon. She thought maybe he would wait a few days. Maybe even try to pretend that everything was fine. But here he was, his face filled with emotion, his eyes searching hers for answers. "Lucas," she whispered, trying to steady her nerves. I didn't want to cause any trouble. I just needed to tell you the truth." He stepped closer, his voice strained. "The truth? About what, Beatrice? About how you've been hiding behind your silence for all these years? About how you've been pretending everything was okay when it wasn't?" She froze. The anger in his voice was undeniable. It cut through her like a sharp blade, but she refused to look away. She had come this far, and now she had to face the consequences. "You're angry," she said softly. "I understand. But I couldn't keep living like that. I couldn't keep pretending that I didn't see how you treated me. How you made me feel invisible." He didn't say anything for a long moment, his eyes fixed on her. She felt the weight of his gaze, like it was dissecting every part of her. She felt exposed, vulnerable, but somehow empowered at the same time. "I never meant to hurt you, Beatrice," Lucas finally said, his voice breaking. "I know I've been distant, but I didn't realize what you were going through." Beatrice's chest tightened as she heard the sincerity in his words. She wanted to believe him, wanted to think that there was hope for them, but a part of her was afraid to trust him again. She had been hurt too many times to fall back into that familiar trap. I don't know if I can believe that, Lucas," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I've been in this house for so long, living under your roof, doing everything you asked of me, and yet, I've never felt like I was seen for who I truly am." He took a step forward, his hands reaching out for hers. "Beatrice, please. I never wanted you to feel that way. You've always meant more to me than you realize." Her heart pounded in her chest. It was almost too much to process. She had been waiting for this moment for years, but now that it was here, she didn't know how to respond. The line between what she wanted and what she deserved had blurred in a way she couldn't fully comprehend. "I can't stay here anymore," she whispered, pulling her hands away from his. "I can't keep living in this toxic environment. I need to go." Lucas looked like he had been slapped. His face fell, and he took a step back. "You're leaving?" Beatrice nodded, the weight of her decision settling on her shoulders. It was painful, but it was the only way forward. She had spent too many years allowing herself to be defined by someone else's expectations. And now, she was choosing to take control of her own destiny. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice strong despite the fear that churned inside her. "And you need to understand why. This isn't about you. It's about me. About what I deserve." Lucas stood still for a moment, processing her words. His face was a mixture of shock and confusion. But there was something else there too, something like understanding. It was as though he finally saw her, truly saw her, in a way he never had before. "I don't want you to leave," he said quietly, "but I understand why you need to go. I don't know what to say. I don't want to lose you." Beatrice's heart clenched at his words. But she couldn't let herself be swayed. She had made her decision, and no amount of pleading would change that. "I need to do this for me, Lucas," she said firmly. "I need to find my own way, away from this house, away from all the hurt. I hope you understand." And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving Lucas standing there, speechless. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Beatrice spent the next few days in a daze. She had left the house. She had left the life she knew so well, the routine that had defined her for so long. She found herself staying with a friend who lived a few blocks away, someone who had always supported her, but even there, she felt out of place. The silence of her departure echoed in her mind, and the emptiness that had once felt like safety now felt like a vast, gaping hole. She had made the right choice. She kept telling herself that over and over, but the pain of leaving was undeniable. The life she had built with Lucas, with his family, had been all she had known for over a decade. The thought of starting over, of finding her own path, terrified her, but she knew deep down that it was the only way forward. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to truly feel the weight of her emotions. She cried. She mourned the loss of everything she had thought was real. She mourned the love she had never received, the validation that had always eluded her. And yet, amidst the tears, there was also a sense of relief. The chains that had bound her were finally broken. She was free. As the days passed, Beatrice focused on herself. She enrolled in a local community center, taking classes in things she had always wanted to learn, but never had the chance to explore. She picked up a paintbrush for the first time in years, creating artwork that spoke to the pain and beauty she had experienced. She began to rebuild herself, not just physically, but emotionally and mentally. But even as she found her footing, there were moments when her thoughts returned to Lucas. She wondered how he was coping, whether he had taken her words to heart, whether he had truly understood the gravity of her departure. She wondered if he missed her as much as she missed him. But she quickly reminded herself this wasn't about him. It was about her. One evening, as Beatrice was walking back from the center, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She took it out, her heart skipping a beat when she saw the name on the screen. It was Lucas. With trembling fingers, she answered. Beatrice, his voice came through, softer than she had ever heard it. I don't know what I'm doing anymore. I've been thinking about everything you said, and I realize how much I've taken you for granted. Beatrice paused, feeling her chest tighten. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected him to reach out so soon, especially after everything that had happened. But there was no turning back now. She had already made her decision. I don't know if I can believe you, Lucas, she said, her voice steady. I don't know if I can trust you anymore. I don't expect you to, he replied quickly, but I want you to know that I've been working on myself. I'm seeing a therapist now, trying to understand the things I've done wrong. I want to be a better person, for you and for myself. Beatrice felt a pang in her heart. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to think that things could somehow be fixed. But part of her knew that trust, once broken, could never be easily repaired. I'm glad you're taking steps to change, she said, her voice quiet. But I can't come back, Lucas. I can't go back to that life. I need to move forward, on my own. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. She could hear him breathing, as if he was processing her words. I understand, he finally said. I don't want to lose you, but I understand why you need to go. And if this is what's best for you, then I'll respect it. The conversation ended shortly after that, and Beatrice sat down on the curb, her hands shaking. It was over. She had made her choice. And now, there was no turning back. But for the first time in years, she felt a sense of peace. She had chosen herself. She had chosen her freedom. Beatrice awoke the next morning to the soft hum of the city, the noise from the streets below seeping into her small apartment. It wasn't much, but it was hers. For the first time in her life, she felt as though she had control. The decision to leave Lucas and his toxic influence had shaken her to the core, but it also unlocked a part of herself that she had long buried. She stood up, stretching, and walked over to the small kitchen. The faint smell of coffee greeted her as she poured herself a cup, the steam rising in the morning light. She hadn't had a quiet morning like this in years. The stillness felt new and familiar, but also comforting. Over the next few weeks, Beatrice immersed herself in her new life. She continued attending the community center, where she met people who genuinely cared about her. She also found solace in the routine of her work. While it wasn't glamorous, being a housekeeper had allowed her to survive, to get by, and now, it gave her a sense of purpose. She didn't need Lucas or anyone else to define her worth. But there were still moments when her mind wandered back to the past. She missed the idea of love, the companionship she had once thought she could build with Lucas. The loneliness sometimes felt unbearable. She thought about his words, his attempts to change, to show remorse, and wondered if she had made the right decision. One evening, as she was finishing her shift at a new client's home, she heard a knock on the door. She opened it to find a young man standing there, holding a bouquet of flowers. His dark eyes looked familiar, and for a brief moment, she couldn't place him. He introduced himself as Anthony, the son of the woman she had been working for. Beatrice smiled softly, surprised by the gesture. "Hello," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "I just wanted to thank you for everything you've done for my family," Anthony said, handing her the flowers. "My mom said you've been a great help, and I just thought I'd bring you these." "Thank you. That's very sweet of you," Beatrice replied, taking the bouquet. There was something kind about Anthony, something warm that made her feel a little lighter. As they talked, Beatrice couldn't help but notice the way he looked at her. It wasn't the same look she had gotten from others, people who saw her as a cleaner, a helper, a nameless face. No, Anthony saw her. He looked at her as an equal, someone worthy of more than just the work she did. Over the following weeks, Anthony continued to visit, sometimes bringing flowers, sometimes just stopping by to chat. Beatrice found herself drawn to him, though she quickly reminded herself to keep her distance. She couldn't let herself fall for someone like him. She had been hurt too many times, and there was still too much to figure out in her own life. But Anthony didn't give up. He never pushed her, but he was always there, ready to listen and support her in any way he could. Slowly, Beatrice began to open up. She talked about the pain of her past, the hurt she had experienced at the hands of Lucas and his family, and the difficult decision to leave everything behind. Anthony didn't judge her. He simply listened, and for the first time in a long time, Beatrice felt like someone truly cared. One evening, after a long day of work, Anthony invited her to dinner. It was simple, just a small gathering at his apartment, but it felt special. Beatrice wasn't sure what to expect, but she agreed, knowing that she needed to take this next step toward healing, even if it was small. They sat down to eat, and as the night wore on, something shifted between them. There was a connection, a bond that Beatrice couldn't deny. It wasn't about love at first sight. It was something deeper, something that went beyond the physical. Anthony made her feel seen, respected, and appreciated in a way that no one ever had before. When the evening came to an end, he walked her to the door. "Beatrice," he said softly, "I know you've been through a lot, but I want you to know that I'm here for you, for whatever you need. No expectations. Just, if you ever want to talk, or if you need someone to lean on, I'm here." Beatrice's heart fluttered, but she didn't know what to say. She hadn't expected this, hadn't anticipated that someone could care so much. But as she stood there, looking into Anthony's sincere eyes, she felt something stir inside of her, a possibility. Maybe there was more to life than the pain she had experienced. Maybe there was room for healing, for growth, and even for love, if she was willing to take the chance. She smiled softly, the first real smile she had smiled in years. "Thank you, Anthony. I think I might just take you up on that." The days following Beatrice's conversation with Anthony were filled with a quiet anticipation. She found herself thinking about him more than she intended. He had been nothing but kind to her, and while she had kept her guard up, there was a warmth that she hadn't felt in a long time. Anthony's presence, whether it was through a simple text or an unexpected visit, made her feel human again. Not just someone who existed to clean and take care of others, but someone worthy of care and attention. It had been a week since their dinner, and Beatrice had decided to give herself a little grace. She hadn't fully let go of the bitterness that clung to her memories of Lucas, but she was trying. For the first time, she allowed herself to smile without guilt. She had worked hard to create a life on her own, one that didn't rely on anyone but herself. The sound of the phone ringing broke her thoughts. Beatrice picked it up, her heart skipping a beat when she saw Anthony's name on the screen. He didn't call often, so when he did, it always felt significant. "Hello," she answered, trying to keep the nervousness out of her voice. "Hey, Beatrice. It's Anthony," came his voice, warm and comforting as always. "I was wondering if you'd like to grab coffee tomorrow. I know you're probably busy, but I just wanted to check in with you. See how you're doing." Beatrice hesitated for a moment. She wasn't used to being asked how she was doing. The question felt foreign to her, like it was meant for someone who mattered. She had spent so long focusing on everyone else's needs that it had become second nature. But Anthony's voice, gentle, Understanding made her feel seen. She found herself saying, "I'd like that. Coffee sounds good. Great. I'll pick you up around 10? Anthony suggested. Sure, 10 works, Beatrice agreed, already feeling the flutter of excitement in her chest. The next day, she found herself preparing for their coffee meetup in a way she hadn't anticipated. She took a little extra time with her hair, put on a fresh blouse, and even added a hint of makeup. For once, it wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about feeling good for herself. When Anthony arrived, he greeted her with a warm smile, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He looked good, confident, and Beatrice realized just how much she had missed his presence. The car ride to the coffee shop was filled with easy conversation, the kind that felt natural, no awkward silences, no forced pleasantries. At the cafe, they found a quiet corner, and as they sat down with their drinks, the conversation flowed effortlessly. They talked about everything: life, dreams, small victories. Beatrice found herself laughing more than she had in a long time. Anthony made her feel normal again. Not the broken woman who had been discarded by her husband, not the cleaning lady, but a person, a woman with her own worth, with her own story to tell. As they talked, Beatrice couldn't help but notice how Anthony looked at her. It wasn't with pity or sympathy, but with genuine admiration. It was the first time someone had looked at her like this, and it made her heart swell. But even in the warmth of their conversation, a part of her remained cautious. She had been hurt before, and though Anthony was kind, Beatrice couldn't ignore the lingering fear in her heart. What if it wasn't real? What if he, too, would see her as just another cleaning lady, someone to use and discard when it no longer suited him? She kept the thoughts to herself, though. This was a new chapter, and it wasn't fair to bring the past into it. She wanted to believe in the possibility of something better. As they finished their coffee, Anthony smiled and said, "I'm glad we did this. It's been nice getting to know you, Beatrice. I hope you know, I really respect you. A lot more than you probably think." Beatrice felt the weight of his words. She didn't know if she believed him, but the sincerity in his voice made her want to. It made her think that maybe, just maybe, there was a future where she didn't have to hide her past to be seen as worthy of love and respect. As they stood to leave, Beatrice caught herself lingering just a little longer than usual. She didn't want this moment to end. For the first time in a long time, she was beginning to believe in the possibility of a life beyond the pain she had endured. She wasn't sure where it would lead, but for the first time, she was open to finding out. Beatrice spent the following days in a haze. She had never thought of herself as someone deserving of affection or kindness. Her existence had always been about survival, about getting through the day, about pleasing others, about remaining invisible. But Anthony had changed something in her. He had made her see herself in a different light. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she wasn't trapped by the past. She tried not to overthink their coffee date. Anthony had been kind, yes, but what did it mean? Was it simply an act of compassion, a friendly gesture, or was there something more? As the days went by, Beatrice's thoughts became increasingly filled with doubt. She thought about Lucas, the man who had been her husband for over a decade. Their marriage, a toxic mixture of manipulation, neglect, and cruelty, had left scars that hadn't yet healed. She remembered the times when Lucas had berated her, calling her worthless, telling her she was ugly, trying to break her spirit. In those moments, Beatrice had learned to shrink herself, to hide in the corners of the house, to become smaller and smaller until she could hardly see herself anymore. Lucas had done a number on her, not just with his words, but with his actions. He had made her feel as though she was nothing more than a servant, a body meant to serve his needs, no matter the cost. But then there was Anthony. He had made her feel seen. He had made her feel like she mattered. Still, Beatrice wasn't ready to jump into something new. The pain of her past was too recent, too raw. She didn't know if she could open herself up to anyone else, not after what Lucas had done to her. She feared that history would repeat itself, that she would fall for someone only to have them leave her broken, just like he did. One evening, as she was cleaning the kitchen after dinner, she found herself alone in the silence of the house. The weight of her emotions hung heavy on her shoulders. She had to make a choice. She had to decide if she was going to allow herself the possibility of something more, or if she was going to remain stuck in the past. That was when the doorbell rang. Beatrice's heart skipped a beat. It was late, and she wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened the door, she was surprised to find Anthony standing there, holding a bouquet of flowers. "Hi," he said, his voice soft, almost hesitant. "I thought I'd stop by. I hope I'm not interrupting anything." Beatrice felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had wanted this visit, but now that it was happening, she wasn't sure how to handle it. She stepped aside, allowing him in, and they stood awkwardly for a moment. "I wasn't sure if I should come," Anthony said, his eyes searching hers. "But I wanted to be honest with you. I don't know what you're going through, Beatrice, but I can see you. I can see your strength, your resilience. I know you've been through a lot, but I want you to know that I'm not here to hurt you. I want to get to know you better. I want to be there for you." Beatrice's breath caught in her throat. His words, though simple, hit her like a wave. She had spent so much of her life hiding from people, keeping them at a distance, believing that she wasn't worth the effort. But here was Anthony, standing before her, offering her something she had never dared to ask for. "I don't know if I'm ready," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Anthony reached out, placing a hand gently on her arm. "I understand, but I'm not going anywhere, Beatrice. You don't have to rush. I just wanted you to know that I'm here, and I'm not leaving." Beatrice closed her eyes for a moment, allowing his words to sink in. She could feel the walls she had built around herself slowly starting to crumble. She had been so afraid of opening up, so afraid of being vulnerable. But here was someone who wasn't asking her to be perfect, wasn't demanding anything from her. He just wanted to be there. For the first time in years, Beatrice allowed herself to feel hope. She wasn't sure where this path would lead, but she knew that she couldn't continue living in fear. She had spent so long hiding from the world, from herself, but maybe it was time to step out of the shadows. "I want to try," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I want to try, Anthony, but I need time. I need to heal." He smiled softly, his eyes filled with understanding. "Take all the time you need, Beatrice. I'm here for you, whenever you're ready." The next morning, Beatrice couldn't stop thinking about Anthony's words. There was something in them that made her feel alive, something that pushed her to take the first step toward change. She felt torn, but at the same time, she knew she couldn't keep running from her own feelings. But what she didn't know was that the past, no matter how hard she tried to distance herself from it, would still catch up with her. The phone rang, and upon seeing Lucas' number, a wave of panic washed over her. She hesitated, but answered. "Beatrice, we need to talk," Lucas said with the cold tone she knew all too well. "I know what you're doing. Don't think you're going to escape me so easily." Those words hit her like a punch in the stomach. She felt a chill run down her spine. How had Lucas found out about Anthony? The anguish she had tried to push away was back, stronger than ever. She had made a choice by opening her heart, but Lucas wouldn't let her move forward so easily. He continued, relentless, "I'm the only one who can give you what you need. Beatrice, don't forget who you are. Don't forget your place." His tone made her feel small, insignificant. Memories of all the humiliations she had suffered during the years of marriage flooded back. The pain, the shame, the fear. It all seemed to want to swallow Beatrice whole again. But then, she thought of Anthony. The way he had looked at her, with respect, with affection. Something sparked within her. She no longer wanted to be that woman living in the shadows of a failed marriage. She wanted more. With a deep breath, Beatrice said, "I'm not the same anymore, and you can't control my life, Lucas." She hung up the phone with a gesture of courage she barely recognized in herself. The weight she had been carrying seemed a little lighter now. She knew the battle was far from over, but for the first time, she felt ready to fight for herself. Beatrice felt a mix of emotions. At the same time, she felt a sense of freedom for the first time in years. A part of her still feared what would come next. She knew she couldn't simply move on without facing the consequences of her past. And the greatest consequences would come from Lucas, who wouldn't give up easily. After that phone call, Beatrice spent the following days in a constant state of alert. She knew Lucas would come looking for her, and maybe even try to confront her directly. But what troubled her the most was the fact that Anthony had gotten involved in the situation. He didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of her tumultuous marriage. He deserved something better, someone free to love him without the chains of a toxic relationship. Then, he called. The sound of the phone vibrating on the table made her heart race. She already knew who it was. She hesitated, but this time, answered without thinking twice. "Beatrice, can we talk?" Anthony's voice was soft, but there was an underlying concern that she couldn't ignore. He knew something was wrong. He knew she was struggling with something much bigger than she could explain. "Yes, Anthony," she replied, her throat tight. "I need to tell you the truth about what's going on." He insisted on meeting her, and when Beatrice arrived at the cafe where they had agreed to meet, she felt a suffocating anxiety. She sat at the table, looking around as if expecting something or someone to interrupt everything. But nothing happened, just the expectation of a confrontation that would be necessary for her to finally free herself from it all. Anthony arrived, with a serious yet warm expression. He looked directly at her, and the truth in his gaze made Beatrice feel braver than she had ever imagined possible. "Beatrice, what's going on? You know you can tell me everything, right?" He spoke with a calmness that contrasted with the storm raging inside her. She looked at his hands, then at her own, trembling. There was no turning back. It was time to expose the truth. She took a deep breath and began speaking. She told him about her marriage to Lucas, about the years of verbal and emotional abuse, about the fear that consumed her every day, about the pressure she felt, not only from her husband but from society, which judged her for her race and social condition. She told him everything, without holding anything back. And when she finished, there was a sense of relief, of liberation, as if the weight of a lifetime had finally been lifted. "Anthony, I need to get out of this. I can't continue with Lucas, but I'm scared of what he'll do when he finds out." Her voice was trembling, but she felt stronger, more alive than she had ever been. Anthony listened attentively, then said, with a softness that touched her heart, "You're not alone, Beatrice. I'll help you. You deserve to be happy, and we can make that happen." Beatrice felt something new growing inside her. Hope. For the first time in a long time, she believed that she could build something different for herself, something not defined by Lucas's lies and manipulations. But she knew the fight was just beginning. The wind gently rustled the trees around, and the scene was calming. But Beatrice felt a tension in the air she couldn't ignore. Anthony's support seemed to be what she needed to take the next step, but she knew Lucas wouldn't stay silent. He wouldn't allow her to leave without a fight. She knew she'd have to face her husband and confront his threats. No matter how violent his words were, Beatrice couldn't hide anymore. She had found her strength, and now it was time to use it. In the following days, Beatrice gathered her things and started preparing for the confrontation she knew was inevitable. Anthony would help her leave, but the final decision would be hers. She would have to take the lead in this battle. But while preparing, something unexpected happened. Lucas showed up at her house. She saw him through the window, standing at the door with the threatening look she had feared. He wasn't alone. He had some of his friends with him, looking more intimidating than she ever imagined. Fear set in instantly, but Beatrice wasn't going to back down. She took a deep breath and went to the door. When she opened it, Lucas stared at her with a forced smile, trying to maintain the control he always used. "I knew you'd do this, Beatrice. You think you can run away from me? There's no life for you without me." His voice was cold, cutting, but Beatrice didn't let herself be shaken. She had heard those words too many times before. She was tired of being controlled by him. "No, Lucas, I'm no longer yours. I was never yours. I have my own life now, and I'm ready to live it." Her words were direct, firm. She didn't hesitate. "You'll regret defying me. I can destroy you, Beatrice. I have the power to do that." He tried to intimidate her, but Beatrice felt a strength inside herself she had never known before. She wasn't afraid anymore. "I'm already destroyed, Lucas. You destroyed me all these years. But now, I'm going to rebuild everything, and you can't stop me." Beatrice spoke without hesitation, looking directly into her husband's eyes. He stepped back from the door in silence. No words. His expression changed. And it was then that Beatrice realized something she had never imagined. Lucas no longer had control over her. He was just a man, and she was no longer the submissive woman he thought she was. Beatrice closed the door, without looking back. She knew this wasn't the end, but a new beginning. The days that followed were not easy, but they were filled with a sense of liberation. Beatrice's life, which had been shackled for so long by fear and silence, was finally her own. She no longer had to shrink herself to fit into the role that Lucas had tried to force on her. Now, she could breathe freely, without the weight of his oppressive words. Beatrice moved out of the house she had shared with Lucas for years. She found a small apartment in a quieter part of the city, away from the echoes of her past. It wasn't much, but it was hers. It was a place where she could finally start anew. As the weeks passed, Beatrice began to build a routine. She went to work, spent time with Anthony, and slowly started to rediscover her own identity. The scars from her years of emotional abuse were still there, but she knew she could heal them. She was no longer just a housekeeper. She was Beatrice, a woman with dreams, with hope, and with a future. One day, as Beatrice was cleaning her apartment, a knock came at the door. She opened it cautiously, unsure of who it might be. Standing there was Anthony, with a bouquet of flowers in his hand, and a smile on his face. "I thought you might like some company," he said gently. Beatrice smiled, a genuine smile that felt different from the ones she used to give. "I'd like that very much," she replied, stepping aside to let him in. They sat down together, talking about everything and nothing. It was the first time in a long while that Beatrice felt truly at peace. Anthony's presence was comforting, but it wasn't just his presence that made her feel good. It was the feeling of being seen for who she truly was. Not for her appearance, not for her job, but for the person she had become. After everything she had been through, Anthony didn't judge her. He didn't expect anything from her except to be herself. And for the first time in her life, Beatrice felt worthy of love and respect. She realized that the love she had been searching for all those years had been right there, within herself. She didn't need to rely on someone else to feel valuable. She had to love herself first. As the evening went on, Beatrice and Anthony shared stories about their lives. It was a conversation that felt like it could last forever, and for the first time, Beatrice didn't feel the need to rush. She was exactly where she needed to be. Later, as Anthony stood to leave, he paused at the door. "I'm really proud of you, Beatrice. You're stronger than you think." Beatrice smiled and nodded. "Thank you. I'm finally starting to believe that." And with that, Anthony left, leaving Beatrice standing in the doorway. A woman who had found her strength. She had left behind the man who had broken her, and in doing so, had discovered her own power. Beatrice didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time, she was excited to see where it would take her. She was no longer a prisoner of her past. She was free.